I would also say that the relationship between these two paragraphs is that in the first paragraph, we see that the Washington, D.C. Police are doing increased security. However, the second paragraph said that the federal government did not recommend them to do this, which suggests to me that perhaps there is some sort of not so happy relationship between the federal government and the Washington, D.C. city government, and that perhaps they feel that the federal government is not helping them enough, and they feel they have to take steps on their own without the assistance of the federal government. These are things that the effective reader does while he's reading, constantly looking for relationships, constantly looking for important words. In addition, words that are related to each other, looking for the main idea of different sections, looking for important words, like I did, comparing new information to previous information, like when we explored the relationship between the two paragraphs, looking for examples and specific details to illustrate ideas, like I did when the first paragraph introduced an idea and then illustrated it with an example, looking for conclusion sentences, which may lead to transitions in topics or ideas, and of course changing your speed. Like we said earlier, it's an adaptive process, a flexible process, and so we can speed up or slow down. These are things that we can actually practice in the classroom. Now, after we read, you can ask your learners, okay, we read these two paragraphs from this newspaper article. With a neighbor, I want you to write a one-sentence paraphrase of them in your own words. This is where students begin to use writing skills. And this is more of a pedagogic task, but it is, in essence, it is a form of composing, because it's a skill that requires both reading and writing. And so it's a skill that requires the combination of several different sub-skills. And so the learners can take what they read and what they understood of what they read and then combine it and rewrite it in a paraphrase. And this is the basic summarizing skill. And this is the most important, the core skill for creating a summary, is to create an effective paraphrase. But also after we read, remember, like I said, that reading is an evaluative process. And we can't just accept what we read as fact. If someone says, this is a wonderful author, we'll say that Leo Tolstoy is a wonderful author, and that's that. Does that mean that you can't evaluate what you read? If I were to read a short story by Chekhov, for example, am I allowed to criticize it? Well, of course I am. Anybody is. That's part of being an effective reader. So you can ask your students to evaluate what they read. And in addition, ask them to evaluate the actions about which they read. For example, this article was about the subway system in the United States increasing security because of a bombing in Moscow. And learners can evaluate that. Do they think that's actually a good idea? Do you think it's necessary for an American city to increase security on their transit system because of something that happened on the other side of the world? Why or why not? Let's look at first pre-reading. And here's an example activity. And what we have here is the headline from a newspaper article from the Washington Post, and a photograph from that article, and then a caption underneath the photograph. And what you can do is ask your students, based on what you see here, the headline, the photograph, and the caption, what do you expect? Now, when it comes to writing, generally speaking, I want to give you just the most basic of the guiding principles that we looked at very, very early in this course. So just a summary, if you will. Writing is seen as a series of recursive steps. And so we plan, we draft, write, rewrite, and we publish. And we don't necessarily go from step 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. We can go to 3 and then back to 2, and then maybe skip 3 and go to 4. It's recursive, so it goes back and forth depending on what we're writing or how skilled we are. And this process it's designed to approximate the process used by effective writers. And the teacher in this process is not seen as somebody who is opening the student's head and putting information in. We're seen as a guide for building strategies. So the student is doing most of the work here. Our goal is to model these strategies and to provide them with scaffolded exercises within which they can safely and effectively develop and practice these skills. And writing is seen as a means to an end, meaning that we write for a reason, just like we read for a reason. And in an academic setting, well, maybe the reason is just because your teacher asked you to, but there's actually a bigger reason than that. And it may be because you want to get a degree, or you may actually believe, if the teacher is effective, that hey, this assignment is actually going to help me to be a better speaker of English. In the real world, of course, the reason why we write is a little bit clearer. We're writing an email message because we want somebody to read it. We're writing a recipe because we want somebody to cook. And so, from that point of view, writing is communicating. Just like when the reader comes to the text, it's an interactive process. Well, the writer is part of that process. And so when we are writing something, we are always aware of who our reader is. And taking email, for example, everybody writes emails, but everybody's email looks different depending on who we're writing it to and depending on why we're writing it. An email to a classmate is going to look very different, we hope, than an email to a professor. But things like jokes, recipes, articles, memos, summaries, depending on why we're writing and who we're writing to, what we write is going to look very different, which means that writing is effective writing, especially effective writing instruction, is always situated within a contextual, communicative context. All right. So, when it comes to selecting text and working with text for summarizing, okay, so basically what we're doing with a summary writing lesson is we're first helping students develop their reading skills. And then we're going to take what they learn from the reading and help them to develop their writing skills by summarizing the text. So when we are choosing a text which students are going to summarize, we should follow these criteria. We want the text to be at an appropriate level, obviously, I+1. We want them to be able to understand it without too much difficulty, but also for it to be a little bit above their current level, just a tad. When it's possible, the text should be written for native speakers. There are a lot of interesting texts in course books, but they often lose their context in that case. And so while a textbook may have reading that is appropriate for the learner's level, it may not be as interesting to read. Whereas the benefit of a contextualized text, something written for a native speaker like a newspaper article or a website, the context is clear. And I think I've made it clear how important context is. Sometimes the text can be too difficult. But I don't think that's necessarily a problem. I think that very often teachers are afraid to give text that is too difficult. But I think that learners can handle it a lot more than we think that they can. Which means the text should be within a communicative context. In other words, the kind of text that we use is in part determined by the goals of the learner and the level of the learner. However, the communicative context can be basically, for example, a newspaper article. There's a reason why we read newspaper articles. And of course we have a certain way that we approach newspaper articles. And there's a certain way that a newspaper is organized. And we have certain strategies that we use when looking at a newspaper. This is all the context of reading a newspaper article. Very often in a textbook, it is just the article without the context. The teacher should certainly be aware of the rhetorical structure of the text. And so, for example, an essay has a certain structure, beginning, middle, and end. A thesis statement, paragraphs have topic sentences. You have arguments that are illustrated with specific examples. Newspaper or magazine articles generally begin with a lead. In other words, they start with the most important information, and then each subsequent piece of information is less important than the previous. The text should certainly be of interest to learners. Remember, like we said earlier, that reading is a learning process. And if it's interesting, it probably means that they're going to learn something. They're going to learn some new information. They're not just practicing their English skills. They're actually exploring something that is interesting to them. And model summaries are extremely important. I have some sample model summaries of articles that I will share that are available on the website. I find that, just like Hyland says, using model texts can be very useful. Some teachers have criticized it, but I find that when I use a model, students see more clearly what is expected of them. And the way that I approach it is I don't let them take the model home. I let them look at it in the classroom, and then I want them to create their own. If I allow them to take sample summaries home, they tend to to copy it, basically. This is difficult to stop. I know that you can search Google for model summaries.